as part of the Strategic Farm East with AHDB and other studies, several years ago, very young man, fresh out of college, persuaded him to come into weed science. I said it was a very exciting field, and we did end up in the field digging lots of holes, so that is what a lot of weed science is about. And I think, as Henny said, when it comes to weed management, we really need to start from concepts of the seed bank and understanding principles of weed management that come from understanding the seed. So I want to talk about the seed bank just in 3 simple numbers. The first of which is that when you're in a field, an arable field, conventional arable field with lots of cultivation, only about 5 to 10% of the weed individuals are present as seedlings of the plants at any one time. The other 90 to 95% of the individuals are present as seeds in the seed bank. Now, this is one of the things that cultivation systems change. As you have less cultivation and less burial and less buffering, you will tend to get a closer relationship between seed bank abundance and above ground plant abundance, because more of the proportion of seed banks in the surface layer. So just understanding how often in the field you're looking very much at the tip of the iceberg when you're managing weeds in the field is really important. The majority is in the seed bank. The second point to make is that seed banks are not heterogeneous. They have a vertical structure which comes about as an interaction between cultivation approach and history in terms of weed seed shed. So in the Strategic Farm East, we have 2 fields as examples, in one of which only 5% of the target weed in the field, which in this case is Italian rye-grass, is present in the surface layer of the seed bank. And in another field, which is actually in an SFI scheme at the moment, 95% of the seeds are in the top 5 centimetres of the seed bank. And understanding that vertical structure in the seed bank, which is an interaction between, as I say, between the cultivation system and often your rotation, should drive your cultivation choices. There are times when doing nothing is the very best approach for managing the weed seed bank, and there are times when doing quite a lot is the best approach to managing weed seed. And the third thing, which Henny alluded to, which I think is really crucial in terms of how we think about weed management going forward, is that not all of the weed individuals in your seed bank are necessarily the target problematic weed that you have in the field. So, for example, in the Strategic Farm East, Italian ryegrass is pretty much the only weed visible in the field in the crops that are being managed, and yet in the seed bank there are over 20 weed species. In other samples that we've done, Will and I did some work on blackgrass fields. There were 30 plus species in the seed bank, but critically, in Strategic Farm East, 75% of the individuals in the seed bank are the target weed, and in other blackgrass fields that we've surveyed, you can have 30 weed species, but 95% of the individuals are present as a single weed species. And the problem is one of dominance of the aggressive weed and a lack of evenness and diversity in the seed bank. The problem is not the seed bank per se, or even the weed species. It's that through management, we've got a seed bank dominated by injurious weeds. So those 3 principles, I think, are what we hang on to when we think about how we want to change weed management, create evenness and diversity, and how we need to manage weeds and understanding the seed bank.
Brilliant, thank you very much, John. So John there mentioned Strategic Farm East. So for those of you who don't know, AHDB has a network of research into practice trial farms across the UK. We just have a couple of them at the moment, but we're kind of building that network as we go. So if you do want more information about the Strategic Cereal Farm Network, please do come and chat to me afterwards. There's plenty of trials going on, but obviously talking about the weed management one is today. Does anyone else want to comment on the weed seed bank? Good. So, our second question, we obviously have a wealth of knowledge here on integrated weed management controls, and so my next question for my panel is about sort of new management practices or new technologies that are coming forward that provide a great opportunity for cultural weed control. So I'm just going to start with Will on this question.
Yep. Yes, so I think I think John alluded to it, that we've been using herbicides for a number of years to control our weeds, and generally speaking, in general, they've been very, very successful. But we've now got an opportunity to start to diversify our practices of in-crop control. I think that's often been, we spend a long time talking about cultural controls, what we do outside of the crops to manage our weed populations. But we now have an opportunity to start to target our weeds in a different way. So Herbicides typically are being applied as a residual pre-emergence herbicide, so we're targeting the weeds as they germinate, or we're targeting them as very young seedlings with post-emergence contact chemistry. That's the chemistry that's particularly affected by herbicide resistance. So now we need to look at those other technologies in which we can start to target weeds at that stage, at other stages of the growth in the cycle. So I spent a lot of work doing work on inter-row cultivation, which is a mechanical system in which we're going to be destroying weeds that are taking up space between the rows, and very exclusively between the rows. And it can be very successful, again, as the focus point was around blackgrass, because often it's been a technology, you'll look at it on broadleaf weeds or maybe weeds that aren't the most important in our systems. Actually, the relation to those new technologies on the weeds that are 60% of the seed bank and 95% of the seed bank are the ones we really need to target. But now we've got these other technologies coming along, so Jonathan will talk about some of the technologies that Garth would have outside of the inter-row hoe range. But things like the Zern top cut collect, we're now beginning to target weeds and collect them from the fields and then dispose them in a sustainable way that we weren't able to do before. So we're now opening up our opportunities to not just target weeds at one or two times in the life cycle. We're now able to target them just before harvest, or even during harvest. We start to look at seed mills, for example. I think that's the really interesting future for weed management, because we are starting to, we don't have to just focus on one individual point, and we need to rely on that. We now got opportunities to control weeds through the cycle.
Go for it, John.
I wasn't really concentrating when you said, is there anybody else going to say anything about the weed seed bank? And I want to say I've got the biggest weed seed bank in this whole room, and I'm really proud of it. So we haven't sprayed any herbicides for 25 years, and so obviously we do have a big weed seed bank, but it's actually understanding how you manage that, given the life cycles of different weeds, and the way we do that is making our rotation as complex as we can. In terms of, the difference between winter and spring cropping, obviously you know how, if you're drilling everything, you're trying to get winter crops in every single year, you're selecting lots of winter weeds and vice versa with spring crops. So we try and, mix up the rotation so we're not doing that the whole time. And the whole ethos is not letting one thing dominate. And I have to say, after 25 years, so my experience is right at the very beginning, because I was a conventional farmer, I really didn't worry about weeds because I could deal with them. And luckily, when we stopped spraying in 1999, there was very little resistance. There wasn't really it just started coming in. It wasn't a massive problem. And the mistake I made was let weeds go early on in our organic rotation. And actually, blackgrass wasn't the problem because we were going backwards and forwards between winter and spring cropping. The big problem was wild oats for us. They just went absolutely rampant. And if you look at a winter wild oat, it sounds like a forest across you literally harvest nothing at all. And I spent 10 years then trying to deal with the wild oat problem. And that's through all the methods that you all know, but just putting all these things together. And the one thing that I learned, actually, there's no one silver bullet. You have to be doing everything. Most of it's done through rotation design and the fire engine treatment at the end. When you've got that wrong, you revert to mechanical weeding, which is what we do. And it's not just with an inter-row hoe we use. The Zern, I think, is an interesting machine. We don't use one because they're terribly expensive, and I think they leave too many weed seeds in the field when they've gone through. But anyway, I'd be happy to be proved wrong on that. But I think the main thing is to remember is that you just have to bring as much complexity into the system as possible. And if you visited my farm today, if you said to John Pawsey 25 years ago when we converted, what is your farm going to look like in 10 years' time having used no herbicides? And I would have predicted an absolute forest of weeds and no crops growing at all. Well, 25 years later, if you came to our farm today, it's got some weeds in it, but actually nothing is dominating, and that's the key, is that you mustn't let one thing dominate in terms of weeds, pests, or diseases, and that's about complexity in your system. The difficulty is that we look at the crops that bring complexity to our system, we say to ourselves, well, they don't make us as much money as having a winter wheat crop or whatever it is. I think after you've got problems, you've just got to get real. You've got to start thinking about long-term solutions rather, is next harvest going to produce the maximum gross margin I would expect if I got my plan crop in the ground. So it's just get real, think long-term, and it'll all be absolutely brilliant.
You can always count on John for a bit of positivity, so thank you, John. So I want to hand over to Jonathan now. If you'd be happy to talk about some of the kind of technologies that you're all seeing coming through, and obviously what we've been talking about so far has really been focused on arable crops, but obviously you work in across horticulture and a whole other range of crops. So yeah, I wonder if you could maybe comment on what we're seeing.
Yeah, so good morning everyone. Jonathan Henry and Garford Farm Machinery. So, we've been working in the weeding business since 1986, and specifically bringing a vision-guided toolbar to the market. On that toolbar, we can do lots of things repeatably and consistently over and over again. And that can be, most often it's a hoe. That's the most common of what we do. But we can also precisely place liquids, precisely place granular material, again leveraging that technology. And that's been core to what we do there. And our parent company, Zern Harvesting, has invested in the Top Cut Collect, which is an interesting technique. It's not a miracle cure, and actually I don't believe any of the alternatives are a miracle cure. I think that ultimately the path forward with the new technologies, in most cases they're actually reuse of old technologies, but applied in a more sophisticated way. These capabilities allow, the seed bank management, and we have data that records up to 70% of the weed seeds are removed with a Top Cut Collect. So yes, it's not a total takes all, but it's a multi-year.
I told you I was wrong. I knew I was going to be wrong.
We don't have data from every single run. Another approach there is also fixing it on the combine or reducing the impact of the combine, because of course the combine is, if a weed could vote for the machinery it loves the most, it probably would actually, it would put top trumps on the combine, because what it does in terms of separating and redistribution is almost perfect. And we have on our stand, again from Zern Harvesting, a seed terminator, which is a milling system that takes all the material that goes over the cleaning shoe, and that's about 95% of the wheat seeds are going over the cleaning shoe, and that processes those so that they will not germinate. And it catches about 97% based on the data that was done there. So that's something that we've seen very, very strongly adopted in Australia. In fact, almost 90% of combines now sold in that marketplace are delivered new with that type of processing mill. And you've got a customer base there that's very, very sensitive to invasive species, because they've got some great scenarios or great textbook examples of where things have gone wrong, and I think that's what's led to such a high sensitivity to this area and very rapid adoption there. And we're seeing lots of interest of it in the European market, but adoption curve is quite a bit slower at this point. As we look forward to other technologies, or it's more re-adoption of old technologies, then there's various things out there. A lot of them had a lot of funding over the last 5, 6, 7 years in the startup space, and we've been evaluating those and looking at which ones should we couple up with that would be a best fit for us. We've looked at laser. We see laser now in the marketplace commercially. We think that laser has a space. We personally have not yet invested in that. We've looked at foam and other heat concentrated treatments, but the one that we've decided to partner with is electric weeding. And so this is using a type of electric weeding where we pass the current through the plant, including the root, using the soil as a return conductor. This means that we get heat into the plant cells, not just above the ground, but also below the ground. And that gives us a systemic treatment. And so we're using physics here. That warming of the plant cell causes it to desiccate then afterwards. And we've got very, very effective results coming out of that, efficacy in the very high 90s, very competitive with chemistry and above a lot of those tools at the moment, and also we believe competitive from a cost point of view. And we think that the key piece to adoption of this will be high value crops will take it first because their production system has opportunities for it that make it a better fit, but we think it could work in broadacre providing we can get the power per meter to, it's not so much the commercial challenge because we can actually get there. The challenge will be these, as Will has said a few times, large commercial commodity crop farms have become so labour efficient that if we don't match the productivity of existing systems, then it won't fit the production system. So that will be the key to whether this works or not. It'll be operating with and productivity to be able to do it with existing labour systems. So electric weeding, we actually signed a partnership just over 1 year ago, and we actually have a product here on the exhibition today. And this is an early one. It's actually sold, even though we haven't released the product properly. But we're in the business, and we'd be very welcome to come and have a look at it after this talk.
I think we tend to think in horse and crop, particularly in weeds, about one weed or one solution. There's definitely a theme from today about how the problem is a lack of diversity and a lack of evenness in the weed population that we're trying to manage, and what we want to avoid is dominance by the weeds that become problematic. The solution is actually a mirror of the problem, that we want to see a lack of reliance on individual weed management approaches, where they're pre-emergent herbicides, whether it might be frequent ploughing in some rotation systems, people become over-reliant on that. It might be glyphosate in a no-till system, and we've seen what that can result in. So the solution is very much a mirror of the problem, in that we want to see a much greater diversity of tools brought to bear as part of the weed management approach, more crops. And we also want, ultimately, to see a much more diverse weed flora persisting and existing in arable fields, because we're not just growing food, we are supporting on a whole landscape scale in a way that no other industry can, the basic biodiversity, the fundamental underpinnings of playing in their country. So it's a real challenge, but I think that's the key. That's what we see emerging, this stop thinking about solutions being dominated by one particular solution and avoid weeds being dominated by one or two problematic weeds, but really focus on that diversity solution, adoption of new technology.
I think that's sort of very much echo of that, but I think it's also that John's point, he has seen a line of efficacy from something like top-up Gillette. That might link into the weeds that you've got, and not each of these technologies is going to have its own niche to some extent, and weeds it will be very effective on, weeds it won't be as effective on. So you need to some extent match the technology up. I think we often say herbicides, and that's a big basket.
Yeah.
There's total active ingredients, 13 active ingredients available in the UK, and we don't use every single one of those for every single weed. So if you break out herbicides and say each active is a technology, we're joining those up in the same way that we're adding an electric weeder will be very good on certain weeds in certain growth stages and certain crops because we get activity on them at that time. It might have limitations in. I don't want to say there are limitations, but currently there might be limitations on narrow roads because you can't engineer the system right now. Doesn't mean it won't come. So I just think we need to be wary that just seeing a technology, it doesn't work because I've got black grass. That's not the end of the world. Because hopefully you'll have a more diverse weed spectrum with a different system, and therefore those technologies become more useful as we create our system with that.
That's practice.
I was just going to add on the electric weeding. Electric weeding will work. It will kill a plant whatever the growth stage, but whether it's economic or not is a different question. So the energy needed is proportional to the biomass. So at late growth stages, we can electric weed and kill, but the amount of energy that's needed then is above the threshold, well above the threshold cost of of existing systems, right? So still below the cost of manual weeding. Right? It's easy to come under that ceiling, let's say. The technology works. There's no question about that. It's the economic threshold, and then the key piece will be the system integration using existing tractors and labour availability as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very sorry to kind of pause that there. I could kind of let you guys all keep talking for much longer, but I think, John, you really summarised it far more eloquently than I would, that diversity is really the key, a diversity of approaches, a diversity in your weed seed bank. John Pawsey was talking about a diversity in his rotation, so I think that really is quite a key takeaway from today. We don't have a huge amount of time left. We've probably got time for possibly 2 questions, depending on how long the answers take. So I'm looking at you, John. If we do have any questions, if you want to pop your hand up, we do have a roving mic that should find its way to you. Any questions from the floor? Oh, that was very good.
Thanks. I'm just interested in how we go about creating a diversity of weeds if we've got certain weeds which are dominating at the moment. Is that going to involve chemicals or not?
I mean, I don't think it does, because we have a diversity of weeds, and it is going back to the point that I made. It's not letting one weed dominate. So in a winter crop, we will have more black grass than we'll have in a spring crop, where we'll have very little. And so I just think it's understanding the weeds we've got and managing the rotation to not let that weed dominate throughout the rotation. I'm very happy with our weed population as it is. I think it, exactly as John says, I think that actually it probably promotes a huge amount of biodiversity that we can see and can't see. So it's about managing them so nothing dominates. Yeah.
The advantage that we have in conventional agriculture is we can use herbicides as well. So wild oats is a good example of something that's much harder to manage in culture control. It's just a bit more intractable from culture control. So there are kind of unacceptable weeds in conventional systems, and there are unacceptable weeds in cattle systems, and to me they're actually slightly different weeds. And I think, with wild oats, even though you might have stacked a real diversity in crops, establishment timing, harvest timing, broadleaf crops, monocot crops, wild oats will still be a bubbling problem in organic systems. But in conventional systems, we can always stack a herbicide on top, of course.
So we have time for one more quick question, if there is one.
Just wondering, underselling and the integration of a lathe, is that how commonly done is that? And does that sort out a majority of your wheat products?
I mean, we always have lathes in our system, and it does help, but it isn't the solution. You're having to do absolutely everything. And I think that, and I was terribly worried about the top car. I'm going to put that right now. Because actually, the work that we've done with wild oats over a long period of time is that if you can get them on the ground and uncollected, a month earlier than if they shed out themselves, then they've got another month to lay on the ground to be predated. But then after that, you've also got to make sure that you don't do anything else to your soil. You just leave them until 3 to 4 months after you've left the wild seeds on the ground. So it's not the fact, and that's why I feel very bad about the top cut, because actually when it doesn't work is when you don't realise that after you've done the top cut and you have some stuff left, you can't just go back to what you'd normally do. You still have to take into account you're going to get some weed return, and if you combine the two things, that's going to be successful.
Brilliant. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions. I feel like this session could have been about 2 hours long, with the amount of knowledge that I have sat next to me. Yeah. Not with ADAS rates. But I just want to say thank you so much to all of you for coming along and listening. It's been a really great turnout, so thank you so much. And also thank you so much to our panelists for coming along. So thanks very much.